My name is Emmanuel Ogbonna, as Fiona introduced me, and I teach and research at Cardiff Business School, Cardiff University here in Cardiff. And I hope the weather is rather better where you are, because it's been raining here in Cardiff all day. And those of you who know Cardiff may be wondering what's new. But we do get the occasional sunshine. It's been raining today all day. So as Fiona said, the one thing that has kept me busy over the last 4 years, and that has excited me, has been the opportunity that the Welsh government gave me to be able to apply some of my research and to apply that to practice, if you like, and to help the Welsh government in looking at the impact of the pandemic on Black and minority ethnic people in Wales, the disproportionate impact of the pandemic, and also helping them on the basis of the report that we produced, which was the first report that labeled a state as institutionally racist. Those of you in England will recall that it wasn't something that was possible in England, but we were able to do that in Wales, and the Welsh government agreed and agreed that something had to be done about it. And they gave us an opportunity again. I was invited again to co-chair a group that developed the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. And it's been a fantastic experience, trying to do what I would ordinarily do and appeal to people like yourselves alone, and to be able to apply that at the level of a state, to the extent that Wales has become, or is going to become, the first country to be anti-racist. At least the plan is to be anti-racist by the year 2030. And we've been working on that. I am co-chairing the group with the permanent secretary of the Welsh government, and it's been a fantastic experience for me. But today I'm going to be sharing my reflections on mentoring with you. And Justin, if we can just have the slide, share the slide, please. I'm going to be sharing my reflections on mentoring with you. And if we can move to the next slide, please, which is the plan of what I want to do today. I'm going to talk to you about a study that I did with a good colleague, friend, in fact, the first PhD student of mine, Professor Lloyd Harris, on university academics, Black and minority ethnic academics in UK universities. One of the papers arising from this study was published in HRMJ in 2023. So if you wanted to read more about it, the paper is there. I want to be able to talk about racism as something that is embedded in the organizational context of UK universities, and it is embedded in the context in which mentoring takes place. So that's an important part of our discussion today. I will then hopefully provide some explanations for the persistence of unequal mentoring, and then share my reflections on how mentoring can be improved. Reflection from not just the point of view of the career aspirant, but also from the point of view of the universities and point of view of the mentors, importantly, because many of the people here are going to be fellows and senior academics that are involved in mentoring. So that's it. Here we go. If we move on, please, to the next slide. So by way of introduction, I think something that we may or may not know, which is that we tend to use heuristics in decision making. Daniel Kahneman will refer to it as system 1, system 2, we tend not to be as thorough, perhaps, as human beings as we could be when we make decisions. And in terms of interpersonal relations, we know that observable characteristics such as age, sex, and race tends to elicit negative stereotypes in people, in relationships. So we use them as heuristics for decision-making, the shortcut, to try and dig into some of the things that we don't have the time, or indeed we are unable to do. So race in that sense is clearly the key base of all these, both as a signifier and as a marker of difference. We know that from research as well. The work of Ashford and Mill would, I think, tell us a bit more about that. But we also know that from evidence that we see in everyday life. So, for example, when we look at the Office of National Statistics in the UK and look at their hate crime statistics, consistently, race is the single most important reason for hate. The latest stats tell us that 70% of all hate crimes are linked to race. And the nearest one was sexual orientation at 24,000. So not quite close in that sense, in terms of a reason for hate. Not that there is any reason that is good, but race seems to be the single most important reason for hate. And we know also that racism is a system of structuring opportunities, but the effects can last for generations. So when we look at people from particular racial groups and ask questions, how come they are not perhaps as successful as they could be? We ought to be looking at the history of oppression and racism against these people, and to be able to begin to understand some of those, because racism then becomes embedded in culture. It can become institutionalized, as we know. We know that from some of the findings we've had in this country, for example, in relation to perhaps the Metropolitan Police, or in relation to universities, as I will share in a few moments or so, or in the case of our report in Wales, in the case of a country like Wales, which is really a proxy for the whole of the United Kingdom. Only the other parts have chosen not to admit it. If we then look at universities and look at some statistical indicators as measure of how things are, we look at HESA data, which is predominantly England, and they tell us that 22% of academic staff were from BME communities in 2023. Actually, I looked at this for the purpose of this talk, and I was surprised, because when we did this study in 2019, we used 2020 data by the time it was reviewed and revised. And the 2020 data was 7.2%. So something has happened. And indeed, in 2020-21, 21-22, is increased by 6%. So it's obviously increased from 7.2% in 2020 to 22% in 2023, which is a wonderful thing in its own right. But you can begin to see some of the trends here. The trends, for me, are obvious. There are fewer white people entering PhD programs, at least the ones that I see. I'm finding that there are fewer and fewer. I've had 2 research grants and advertised for positions, and I'm seeing that fewer people are applying today in comparison with the 1990s, when I had grants and I advertised for positions. And I'm also seeing, although I haven't looked at the data fully, that there are more immigrant, Black and minority ethnic people joining universities. So the numbers are growing. Although, when you look at it, there is still a degree of anti-Blackness, what I call anti-Blackness in UK universities. So everybody else is growing, and we'll still have fewer than 1% of academic staff that are professors that are Black. And that is indicative of some of the problems. But that's not the only group. There are other groups as well. And again, if you look at Black women, I think the situation is even worse for them. But the data is there, and it tells us that in some areas, the representation may be fine, but in terms of progression, we'll still have that problem in gaining the higher positions in British universities. If we move on to the next slide, please. And if we then look at the context of Black and minority, in which Black and minority academics work, we see that universities tend to adopt colorblind policies, where they take very little account of the racial disparities. So policies are made without regard to the fact that UK academic institutions, or indeed the UK society, is highly racialized. So we assume that everybody has an equal opportunity to achieve, when in reality, the data we keep getting keep telling us that there are outcomes are disproportionate and that some groups are favored against other groups. Researchers in education and other fields have studied this and have concluded consistently that policies are commonly presented as neutral, but are really designed to benefit the dominant groups, typically white academics in that sense. And we also know that Black and minority ethnic academics are more likely to suffer from discrimination-induced stress and anxiety. Jason Ade's work raised this, and many others have also said the same thing. And I will come back to that in a few moments. We know also that experiences of groups differ. So I don't want to assume that everybody experiences this in the same way, but Blacks, again, and women tend to, and especially Black women, female ethnic minority academics, but especially Black women, are commonly invisible in the sense that they really have a particularly raw deal. You look at it from every angle. Hopefully, I will come back to that later on. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, as we know, in 2019, found strong evidence of institutional racism within higher education institutions. So these are the universities we are talking about. 50% of staff felt ignored. The findings of the EHRC felt ignored because of their race and ethnicity. 25% of staff, ethnic minority staff, experienced name-calling, insults, and jokes. 5% of them were forced to leave their jobs. Sometimes you leave the job you love so much because essentially the university and the policies they are developing are not there to protect you from all these. It wasn't just academic staff, it was also students in EHRC report. 36% of students were depressed. 8% of them felt suicidal as a result of the way universities treated them, or at least they were treated in universities. Next slide, please. We then look into mentoring. Mentoring is one of the things that is designed to make things better for minority ethnic people. Mentoring in this sense, we define as an activity that involves counseling, guidance, and socialization of career aspirants, typically by an older, certainly more experienced person who understands the institution, understands the profession, understands the culture, understands the secrets, if you like, of success. So essentially, it's a case of passing these secrets and these insights to the early career staff, to help them to be able to navigate career success in that sense. So mentoring is important, because if we want to understand why racism is persisting and how to deal with racism, we need to be able to understand the role of organizational interventions. Now, that's the argument I had in my work that, again, was published in HRMJ in 2019, where I looked at organizational culture as one of those organizational interventions and tried to see how that particular intervention may, again, be working against members of the Black and minority ethnic communities in general. But in this case, in particular, academics, the theories tell us that there is a strong link between mentoring and career success. So if we believe that to be the case, then if we want to achieve career success, we really ought to be looking at mentoring as a way to do this. So for people from Black and minority ethnic communities, it should be no different that for them to have career success, they should be looking at mentoring. Universities should be looking at mentoring if they want to be able to improve the lot of these academics. But we still have limited insights into race and mentoring, especially in academic context, even though it's proven that this context really could do with more understanding of mentoring in general, not just for BME people, but for everyone. Because as Fiona said, mentoring is not always what it's set out to be. There are always contradictions, differences in intentions, etc. And we need to understand how we can improve this. So our study, just to go over this quickly, interviewed 37 people from Black and minority, people who self-identified as Black and minority ethnic, from new and old universities, if you like, in the United Kingdom. The balance, 19 male, 18 women. We had 2 readers and 18 senior lecturers because we wanted to study the pipeline, if you like, all through the top. We weren't able to get any ethnic minority professors. We did the usual transcription, recording, transcription, etc. for analysis. If I move on to the findings, because I want to spend more time on the implications, if I may. So 5 key themes emerged for us from the interviews. The first one was that ethnic minorities, surprise, surprise, or Black and minority ethnic people, had the negative view of university mentoring system. Many of them perceived the mentoring they received, or at least the system of mentoring in their institutions, as highly target focused. Essentially a case of handing down the research ranking of journals and saying to you, here are the journals you need to target if you want to be able to progress. If you're a lecturer, you want to be a senior lecturer, you need to get so many of the 3 stars, so many of the 4s, and so many of the 2s, and you need to do so many of the teaching well, you need to get such research grant and so on and so forth. And people simply were saying, what I need to know is how am I going to get this? How am I going to link with people to be able to help me to be able to get what I need to get? How did you do it? And how, on the basis of what you did, and on the basis of the factor endowment that I have, how am I going to be able to do that, to be able to achieve similar levels of career success? So they believed that that wasn't what they were getting. The second one was that mentors were viewed as selective. We know that mentoring tends to work well or best if the career aspirant and the mentor are demographically similar, especially so on race. We know that to be the case because there's a lot of studies that have been done on this. So in theory, universities should know that where there is racial dissimilarity, there's likely to be a higher likelihood of problems, of difficulties, of conflict, interpersonal conflict, etc., etc. But what are they doing about it? Nothing, as our respondents told us. The universities essentially are putting people together and asking them to work together. But we know we cannot have racial similarity for members of the Black and minority ethnic people because there are very few senior faculty around. As we saw, the numbers of professors continue to be low in ethnic minority professors in UK university institutions. But BME academics also believe that the white mentors they had were very selective about who they gave genuine mentoring. So the university may impose somebody on you to mentor, but you actually go out and choose the people you want to mentor. Hence, you'll be giving them differential treatment. One is part of work, and one is one that you've chosen to do yourself. And unfortunately, the Black and minority ethnic academics were not always chosen as those people that the senior colleagues genuinely wanted to mentor out of their own volition. So they were handed to them and they did what they could, but they weren't the people they would have chosen themselves. And they also believed that some of the white mentors they had believed that what worked for them would be the same thing that would work for BME academic. So they forgot or they don't take into consideration the fact that race is a major determinant of outcomes in many respects. It's a major determinant of whether somebody could go out and get access to study an organization. It's a major determinant of even publishing papers in journals, because unfortunately, we know from research that has been done that there are people who are able to detect from people's writing styles, their race and ethnicity, and unfortunately, they are not always as kind as they could be. And so it kind of undermines this notion that if people do what I did, then they are likely to achieve the same level of success that I achieved. It doesn't always work. I remember studying FTSE 100 organizations a few years ago, 2017, I think it was, a BAM initiative. We studied FTSE 100 organizations, and I carried out all the interviews. And I remember interviewing this lady at an organization, one of the top organizations, and I was asking her about her success, what factors she attributed to her success, and how she felt that her colleagues who were ethnic minorities would be able to emulate that. And she said, oh, I'll tell you something. One of the things I did was I was really interested in becoming the group talent director in this organization. And what I did was I went to the chief executive, whom I knew reasonably well because we associate outside of work. And I went to her and I said to her, this is really the job I want to do. And she said to me, I'm going to give you this project. And if you can do this project for me, this job that you want, which at the time didn't exist in the organization, if you do this project, I will convince the board to create that job for you. And she did the project, and the chief exec convinced the board to create the job for her. So she became the group talent director. And she felt that other people could do the same. And I thought, I don't think so, but I didn't tell her that. So you kind of believe that something that works for you could work for other people, but you forget that there is a key determining factor, which is racial dissimilarity, and that may play a major role, especially if you begin to adopt this colorblind approach, then you don't see it. You just assume everybody has the same opportunity. Everybody has the same chance. Unfortunately, they don't. Even if you think it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the case, which is why we continue to have outcomes that are racialized, even when we think we're doing all the right things. The other thing that came out was that white mentors tend to be scared and closed, as our interviewees argued. And in my view, this is probably the most significant finding, I think. It's significant because you are in a relationship, a close relationship, in a mentoring relationship. It should be a close relationship where you are trusting that someone will guide your career. And if that someone who is meant to guide your career is uncomfortable with interacting or in their interactions with you, then that's likely to influence the outcome. So BME academics use various terms to describe their mentors. They are scared, they are closed, they are terrified, they are guarded, they are nervous, and they are uneasy in their relationships with them. And that has implications that can be profound, as hopefully we shall see in a few moments or so. And move to the next slide, please. So this getting a real mentor, they say, is rare in the sense that the formal university mentoring is seen as ineffective and not authentic, as in the mentors are not real. And many people have left their jobs. They just had to go to somewhere else to see if they can find what they view as a real mentor. Now, what is quite difficult is what's a real mentor. I remember when we were writing this paper, one of the reviewers wanted to know what we meant or what people meant by what a real mentor is. And it's what's a real mentor? I think we all know one when we see them. How do we describe them, though? And some of them tried to describe what a real mentor was. But I think the best way of describing it is you know one when you see them. But BME academics then feel the additional burden of having to find a real mentor for the simple reasons that you have a situation where people are not perhaps as open as they could be, and that are, in a sense, worried about what could happen if they said the wrong thing, whatever the wrong thing may be. It's almost like the BME academic is the Gestapo, and the mentor is too frightened in that sense. And the final one was that getting a real mentor costs, which I thought was interesting at the time of looking through the data. The BME academics perceived mentoring to be transactional. And they talked about the only way you get a mentor to do things, or whenever they do things for you, they often expect payback. And one payback, we're told, was putting their name on a paper you've essentially written so that they become co-authors. I don't think this is peculiar to Black and minority ethnic groups. I think this is probably something that goes on in universities and within mentoring relationships, that if you worked on something and your mentor, your supervisor, or whatever, helped with it, and that you tend to put their names on it. I think the bigger difficulty, though, is the impact on Black and minority ethnic academics can be worse than the impact on, say, a white academic. Because often, when the mentor's name is put on the paper, the assumption is often that the ethnic minority person, the Black and minority ethnic person, didn't actually do much in that paper. And as such, that negative stereotype of their quality, their skills, and etc. would then precede them. They present the paper, and the assumption is, I wonder what proportion of this they did, maybe 5%. they just put their name or whatever that may be because of the negative stereotype, the pre-existing negative stereotype. And that could end up harming the career aspirant in that sense. But that's quite an interesting finding. I want to spend the last 10, 15 minutes or so just going over the implications and talking about what universities and individuals can do. If I move on to the next slide, please. So really, by way of implications, simple. Cross-race mentoring is problematic. We know that already. We know that individuals like to work with, to associate with people that are like them, essentially. Similarity attraction paradigm. We probably all have used it in writing, because there's less conflict, they understand each other, there's less explanation, and you don't have to worry about getting things wrong, putting your foot in it, because you both operate at the same level. You both have received cultural capital. And then there is the Pygmalion effect, of course. The idea that the pre-existing bias and stereotypes that unfortunately we all hold, academics essentially hold, just like other people in society, those pre-existing bias and stereotypes often lead to self-fulfilling prophecy. I suspect that one reason we have such a awarding gap in universities is because of this Pygmalion effect, that academics, whether they agree to it or not, have this pre-existing bias and stereotypes, because we all do. And those bias and stereotypes of ethnic minorities tend to be negative. And because they are negative, in a context where there are two people, one ethnic minority and one white person, because you have already pre-existing negative bias about the ethnic minority, you may consciously or unconsciously or subconsciously put in less effort to help the ethnic minority person. Just subtly. It may not be as obvious as that. It may be subtle. It may be a case of the ethnic minority student asks for help or advice or support. And maybe you are genuinely busy. You say, I'm really sorry, I'm busy, can't do it. And in a different context, the white person asks for the same level of support. And then you're able to find 5 minutes or 10 minutes to give them that support without thinking about it. You haven't intended to discriminate. But in reality, what that does is it forces the ethnic minority person to reevaluate, at least as theorists tell us, reevaluate their own self-efficacy and begin to work according to the same norms that you have yourself about them. And ultimately, that may lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is on the assumption that we are not doing direct discrimination. Then this is one possible explanation to the reason why we would have people join universities at roughly the same entry grades and graduate at very different grades, with the Black academics at the bottom of the pie and with the white academic at the top of the pie. It's got to be something that explains that, because they are coming in with roughly the same level of ability, unless, of course, universities are lying to us. We then look at the context of mentoring, and we say this context is not favorable for Black and minority ethnic groups. The colorblind policies in universities are failing Black and minority ethnic academics. You look at some things, there's something that we changed. I feel very pleased about this the other day at Cardiff, which was, we found that one of the things that they have as a requirement for a job as an early career academic, in other words, somebody who's just finished their PhD, is that they have to have had successful research grant application or research funding of some sort. Essentially, without thinking about it, universities are benefiting people who are ESRC trained, essentially. And these tend to be white academics anyway. And by implication, they are disadvantaging all the immigrant academics that exist because they are not entitled, they are not able to apply for research funding. They're nearly always private sponsored or their states will sponsor them. So they won't be able to meet that criterion. But that criterion is not important in determining ability, yet it was there. And I questioned that, and the university changed it. So there are little things that disadvantage Black and minority ethnic people and that exist as policies in universities. And you can look everywhere you look, practically, you are likely to find one. You look at the EHRC findings of institutional racism, that's yet to be addressed. You may recall a few years ago, Professor David Richardson, who was the Vice Chancellor of East Anglia until recently, he was the University UK representative on equality and diversity. And when this report came out, he was good enough. He went on to tell his colleagues, he accepted it. He said, yes, I accept the findings. And I'm urging my fellow vice chancellors to accept the finding of institutional racism. If you don't accept that you are institutionally racist, you are not going to do anything about it. It's a bit like the Metropolitan Police. You know, Stephen Lawrence inquiry many years ago, you are institutionally racist. They said, no, we are not. Recently, a year ago, another inquiry, you are institutionally racist. No, we are not. So what do you think is going to happen in 20 years' time when another inquiry comes? They will remain institutionally racist because they haven't accepted the findings. And they are not likely to do anything to change what you don't believe is wrong. And that's why it's important in that sense. And of course, the pipeline is limited by the policies and the awarding gap. You know, I've talked a little bit about policy. You know, if you look at the pipeline, you see that there is a particular problem for British ethnic minority people. When I look at the place where I work, I have been there for 34 years as an academic since 1990. And I've only ever seen 4 or 5 other people that look like me go through there as lecturers and etc. And I've not known any other than me that is crossed the rank of senior lecturer. And this is in a context where there are upwards of 250 academics, or maybe 200, maybe academics, I'm not sure, but a huge business school, probably one of the largest in the country anyway, if not the largest. And when I look at the student body, the PhD student body, I don't see many people, in particular, many people who look like me doing PhDs. And some universities have recognized this notion of anti-Blackness. Universities like Bristol, I think Surrey, they've put in money, some £1 million, to try to develop dedicated scholarships for Black academics, especially Black British academics, because they're simply not there. And that is a problem that universities have to think about. If you look at the authenticity in interracial relationships, again, racism is one of the most difficult things for white managers. For white managers to talk about, that should say, not do, or rather dealing with racism or talking about racism is one of the most difficult things that they do. And this is something that research has told us. But we also know that white people don't like to talk about racism. And I suspect this is one of the reasons that our white colleagues feel uncomfortable in any context where they have to mention, to talk about, to discuss, or to even be accused of racism. But we have to talk about it, because not talking about it doesn't mean that it's gone away. And I recognize this because that fear is genuine to many mentors, because we have also spoken to mentors, and this is part of a different paper. And it's a genuine fear that people have. And because people are scared, sometimes it's easier to avoid the topic. But avoiding it in that sense only leads you to treating people differently, even when you don't intend it. You see the example in feedback. Again, this was something that I came across when I studied FTSE 100 organizations. People talked to me about this, that one of the things they were finding was that there were two types of feedback. There was the filtered and the unfiltered feedback. And that for ethnic minority people, they often felt that the feedback they were receiving was filtered, in the sense that people were concerned and didn't want to say anything that could remotely lead you to start questioning them, because it could end up with an allegation of racism. But that then means that feedback becomes a political tool, and a tool that again is designed to disadvantage the person who is from a minority. Again, minority, whether they are women, whether they are minority ethnic people. In this case, we happen to be talking about ethnic minorities. But that's why it's important to think about the authenticity, whether it is the feedback you are giving to people, whether it is in the talks that you have with people, whether it's in the way you are dealing with people. And then we move on to what organizations can do. What can universities do? Next slide, please. So what can universities and individuals do? If we begin with universities, the first thing universities must do is to acknowledge the magnitude of the problem. Many universities are in denial. They don't want to talk about it. You know, race is a dirty, ugly word. Nobody must talk about it. I always liken it to the ancient tale of the 3 Japanese monkeys that denied the existence of evil by variously seeing no evil, speaking no evil, and hearing no evil. But evil didn't go away. Evil stayed. Evil remained, and it was there. So racism isn't going to go away just because universities and senior academics don't want to talk about it. So we need to acknowledge the problem. You know, National Center for Social Research, the authoritative source on this, tell us that in their last survey, that 26% of British people admitted to being racist, admitted to having negative attitude towards people of other races. And a staggering 44% of people believe that some racial groups are naturally harder working. These people are not just people on the streets. They are people like you, like me, that work in universities, that become supervisors of students, PhD students, that are lecturers that mark individuals' work and that mark their group projects and write their references for work, and that are mentors in universities. So they're not going to suddenly take away their racism, their belief, their fundamental belief. Remember, racism is an attitude. They're not going to suddenly take their attitude away. Okay, you could argue that attitude and behavior would not always be related, but we also know that there is that level of cognitive dissonance we experience when there is marked inconsistency between our attitude and our behavior. And unless we do something to try to stop that association, then we are going to have that association. And universities need to understand that. They need to audit their systems, their structures, their processes, and their behaviors to identify these issues these policies, these behaviors, these systems, these structures that lead to disproportionate outcomes. Colorblind approaches would never do, because saying I don't see color is tantamount to saying color, because color is always out there. It's better to talk about how you react to color as opposed to saying I don't see color. There is nobody who doesn't see color. That's the first thing we see. If you ask the police, if they stop people on the road in the scene of crime and ask about witnesses, the first thing they tell them is the person was that color or that color or that color, particularly when the color is different from white. They will tell them immediately. If it's black or brown, or they'll say immediately, oh, they are Asian, oh, they are black, oh, they are this. So saying we don't see color, I think, is not the right thing. We need to develop a culture of anti-racism and build this into our training of mentors. I hear you say training doesn't stop racism. But you see, without training, you may not even know, people may not even understand that what they are doing is racist. What training does is it helps you to develop the cues, to know when you are discriminating. Then it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to do something about it. It is also up to the organization to decide by ensuring that they make it clear the behaviors that will be accepted and the behaviors that will not be accepted, and working towards rewarding and doing something about the people who are persistently not keeping to the behaviors that are not accepted. We don't always give people a choice in every behavior in society. And I can't see why on racism and sexism, we should consider giving people a choice whether or not they would like to behave differently. We should include anti-racism as part of the key performance indicator of all mentors, and then reward them according to their behaviors here. If it is important to organizations, then put money on it. And we're doing that now in Wales as part of the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. Part of the things we've asked universities to do is to have an Athena Swan type metrics for race. In the same way, it hasn't worked fully well, but it's worked in some respect for gender. And I'll tell you why I think so. When I joined Cardiff University, the business school, there was not a single female professor in the business school. It took up until 2000 or so for one female professor, maybe 99, to be appointed. And then it took another 4 or 5 years for more to be appointed. And more were appointed because Athena Swan came in and linked part of the incomes of universities to the way they treat women. It isn't that women became more intelligent when Athena Swan came up, it's that universities began to look at them more when jobs emerged. And that led to an increase in the numbers. We are not where we should be, probably the 50-50. I don't think we're anywhere near there, but it is a damn sight better than it was in 1990 when I became an academic. So this is what we are doing in Wales. Unfortunately for you in England, the current government does not believe racism exists, and as such, you probably would not be having the same. But you can move to Wales and enjoy that. So we then need to think in terms of what the HR function can do. The HR really is a serious gatekeeper in any of these, and it needs to change. And if it doesn't change, we are not going to have any real outcome that is different. And in particular, this idea that employees or people can give very vague rationales for decisions. You know, this person is likely to fit better in this team and so on. It's not something that should be accepted. We should also think in terms of increasing the number of Black and minority ethnic mentors. And where possible, we need to use positive action. And we should encourage open communication with BME academics, because we need to understand their concerns, what worries them, and what can we do to change things. And the final slide, please, final slide, please. Thank you. So again, mentors can understand, they need to understand what racism is. I think colleagues should work harder to understand what racism is, how it is manifested, and how and the impact it has on people. Please try and understand that. Try and review the stereotypes that you hold of racial and ethnic minorities, and open your assumptions, your beliefs to about other people to scrutiny, because we all have these negative stereotypes. We develop them from childhood and they stay on. They get logged in our subconscious, and when we encounter difference, they emerge to help us make decisions, because we don't want to go too deep in trying to analyze things. But if we don't open them up, we keep repeating them, we may not even know that we are discriminating against people. When you go to an anti-racist class and somebody mentions white privilege, don't get offended. Don't assume that they are saying that you were born with a silver spoon in your mouth. That's not what it is saying. All it is saying is, what I say to people is, the other way to look at it is, if somebody mentioned able-bodied privilege, would you feel offended? Chances are you will not, because you can quite easily see that somebody who is able-bodied has an advantage over somebody who is disabled. And as such, it's a similar type of thing, not the same, but a similar type of thing. When somebody is saying, what somebody is saying is, there are things that you don't have to think about, that an ethnic minority person has to think about. And that is all it means. And try and understand why it is that the ethnic minority person has to think more about those things and how it might impact on, or they might impact on their careers. That way, you are in a stronger position to help them and to do things that cannot be perpetuating discrimination. So it is to understand your role, the part you are playing in this process. That's very important. For mentees, career aspirants in the room, I think it's very important to remember that what you're trying to do is to manage somebody else's perception of your identity. It doesn't matter. You have to be pragmatic about it. You're trying to manage somebody, a mentor, their perception of you, of your identity. You've got to make this as positive as you can. Some people even argue that you should adopt political skills, but that's for another lecture. But what you must do is to recognize that your mentor may have a genuine fear of getting things wrong. Put yourself in their shoes and think about how they might get things wrong, and try and encourage open communication with them about race, and be willing to educate. Be willing to tell them, be willing to talk to them, be willing to make it a conversation that they will be happy to engage in, as opposed to one that they are afraid to talk about. If you open it up, maybe, just maybe, people will be willing to learn, and you may be able to change people and they become different, and you benefit more from that relationship. Encourage them to be open and in their feedback. In other words, one of the things I say to my children and people that I mentor is, every time you have a situation where somebody is going to give you feedback, try and make them feel comfortable about talking to you about everything, the good, the bad, the ugly. Don't just, change your face when somebody says something remotely negative, because then they will stop. They won't do it again. Nobody wants confrontation in that sense. So you have a role to play in that as well. So by way of concluding, I know I may have spoken too long. Mentoring is another thing that we should add to the list of organizational interventions that are failing people from Black and minority ethnic communities. But we can improve the effectiveness. We shouldn't see it as a fait accompli, that it would always fail. We can make it better. We can make it work better. And we can do that only when we work with mentors and universities, to ensure that people understand how racism is manifested in society. Because racism will only become a thing of the past when people that have the power to do something about racism start behaving differently. Thanks very much for listening. And if anybody wants any of the full references that I've used, please send me a quick email. I'll be happy to drop them to you. Thank you.